to celebrate hitting 1,000 subscribers here on YouTube, I put out the call for question submissions for an Ask Me Anything, and I got 40 of them, which was way more than I was expecting. So here we go. I promised I would answer each and every one of them, and so I shall. So buckle up and let's dive into them. If you want to skip to a specific question, they are all time-stamped in the description below, so you don't have to watch the whole video if you don't want to. You can jump down and just look for questions that you may find interesting. All right, here we go. Let's answer 40 AMA questions. Muto2525 in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, what inspired you to begin making this game? Was there a specific moment you can recall where you essentially said, this is what I want to do, or was it more of a side project that transformed over time? It all kind of started when I picked up the Cyberpunk 2020 rulebook, which is a really cool older role-playing game that has just an immense amount of crunch to it. It's so crunchy, has really in-depth rules for firearms and cover and all this kind of cool stuff. And I thought that really opened my mind to other design philosophies apart from Dungeons & Dragons, which I had been playing for several years prior. And so I started fiddling actually with a hack of that system, turning it into a Western setting, like a Weird West setting, and that's where it really began. And it was just a hobby that I fiddled with here and there in my free time over the years. I'd set it down for sometimes years at a time and then come back to it. But it was only within the last few years that I decided to buckle down and really just make this the thing I wanted to do. Put all my energy into making this one project. And it's been really fun since then, but it was definitely something I kicked around for a long time before committing. Drudenfusz in the TFE Discord asks, my first question would be, what made you decide to go with Clockworld as your first setting? And, well, maybe also if you think of it as somewhat of a signature setting. Well, Clockworld actually was the very first game I thought of so many years ago. Before I even imagined Tales from Elsewhere as a brand, Clockworld started it all, and therefore I do think it's sort of a flagship or quintessential setting for the game. It's also likely going to be the simplest of the rulebooks we release, as it's going to set a baseline for Tales from Elsewhere's products to build upon. So it's not going to be overburdened by too many other subsystems, so it's definitely going to be like the flagship and quintessential one, mainly because I like Westerns a lot, and I like Weird West a lot, so that's the one I went with. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, what inspired you to make the first book a Weird Western? What were the biggest challenges that you faced when trying to adapt the tropes and histories of Westerns? That's a very good question, and one that I could probably do a whole video on, but I'll give it a brief answer. So, I like Weird West. That's pretty much the reason why. I'm a big fan of things like Deadlands and these sort of properties, and I wanted to make my own with a little bit of a different spin, maybe more of an emphasis on Lovecraftian horror, and on the horror in general. So really, the reason I chose that is just because I like it. I'm a big Western fan. There are some challenges with dealing in a setting that has historical inspiration. Now, the Clockworld setting is technically not our Earth. It is an Earth not too dissimilar from our own. But something that I've done when creating a Western setting is I haven't just looked at one perspective on the Old West of the United States. I've been reading lots of books and ingesting a lot of media from myriad perspectives, for example, from the Native American perspective, from the Chinese American perspective, African American perspective, so on and so forth, because the people that made up the Old West, that forged the West, as it were, are not a monolith. There is different perspectives, different cultures, and different people, and I'm trying to highlight some of that in the mythology and in the characters. So it's a complicated situation, right? And I'm doing my level best to be respectful and still embracing what draws people to the fantasy of the Weird West world, right? That sort of world is a fantasy at the end of the day, and I hope people enjoy the one I've created. DarkTycon and Brage in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord had a great conversation and debate on this subject, so they asked the question, why did you go with Bulk, Brim, and Ace for the targeting system? Any thoughts as to alternative naming structures or acronyms? Oh boy, the names are so hard to choose in games. I have just lost so much sleep over these names. So Bulk, Brim, and Ace, so far that seems to be fairly descriptive, right? You know, the bulk is the center mass, the brim would be like limbs, appendages, and then the ace is the vulnerable parts. But it would be really cool if that was like a cheeky acronym like AIM or BAM. I just can't think of the right word order or terms to use here to change it yet. I am open to any ideas any of you have. It's tricky because I want the acronym to still have that ascending order of vulnerability or difficulty where it starts with the bulk, then the brim, then the ace, because that is a logical progression and how the targeting system works as far as the progression of difficulty. But boy, if people have cool ideas, hit me with them. I am absolutely open to changing any of these terms. Erratik in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, I am curious how you settled on the 11 skills you chose. I would love to hear your thought process around that. Well, there used to be 36 skills in the game, and it was an immense amount of minutia and fiddly bits, and there was a very complicated XP system and selection system. It was a mess. The entire back of the character sheet was this giant skill matrix that I spent a lot of time on and ended up just not really working out. So over time, I've been cutting the skill list down and down and down, winnowing that list until I got to the current 11. And those 11 aren't necessarily set in stone, but they're where roughly I'd like the game to sit. I'm a big fan of, say, splitting charisma, which is often just one thing, into multiple. So we have guile and bravado, representing things like logic and subterfuge and charm, versus something like leadership, bravery, and intimidation. So I've got a split kind of where I'd like it right now, but, I reserve the right to either cut down or add more to it over time. But really, it was just a process of asking myself, what do I need for the game? If this wasn't needed for the game, to cut it down. Was the complexity adding to the depth, or was it just complexity for complexity's sake? So hence the cutting down from 36 all the way down to 11 so far. Mike Birkhead in the Design Discord asks, if you could be any kind of bird, what would you like to be? Oh, that's easy. It's the secretary bird, one of the most elegant and beautiful birds on the planet, and also it kicks the shit out of snakes, and that's awesome. It is absolutely cool. Easy question. So we have two questions here that are overlapping, so I'm going to put them together. We have Danderskoff in the Design Discord and Lonely Cube in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord. They ask, how do you see the game playing for other genres? Would you have to change much for a mech setting or a standard fantasy setting? Are you thinking about, in the far future, making more games or expanding elsewhere into different genres? And the answer is yes. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it would be great to continue to make more books in the Tales from Elsewhere brand. We actually have the rough sketches of other genre books already in production, just because it's fun to do. We've got a medieval setting, a science fiction setting, a modern setting, and all of these would be cross-compatible. They're going to use the same bones, same core resolution systems, and we would just layer additional subsystems on top of that. Say a medieval fantasy setting would have a magic system layered on top. A science fiction setting would have a starship system layered on top. So you'd be able to mix and match these and create kind of interesting combination genres too. Like if you wanted to play a game like Firefly, you could take the Clockworld setting, the Western setting, take the science fiction setting, put them together. You've got kind of a Firefly-esque situation. You could take the medieval fantasy setting, take the modern setting, put them together, and maybe you've got an urban arcana style game. So we have a lot of ideas here for expanding the game, but again, don't want to get ahead of ourselves, one thing at a time. Erratik in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, I love the name Tales from Elsewhere and the Weird West setting. However, the setting name Clockworld evokes steampunk to me. Yeah, so the term Clockworld actually was the first name I came up with. The brand Tales from Elsewhere as a term came later. Clockworld was the internal testing code name for this Weird West setting, because it is steampunk, it's post-apocalyptic steampunk. And at first I thought it was kind of a goofy name, and so it was just going to be temporary till I figured something else out, but after years and years of using it, it's just sort of stuck, and now I like it. Maybe it's not the most evocative term, I'm not sure, but now I just really like it. I was considering, as an example, calling the first setting book just Tales from Elsewhere Weird West, and then other books would just have the genre as the subtitle, but to me that's kind of less fun, less exciting. Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld, it talks to a world, it's speaking of a place, and I kind of like that. But yeah, term's a little goofy, but I think it's here to stay. I just really like it, and hopefully it doesn't confuse people too much. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, what inspired you to develop Tales from Elsewhere? What turned that germ of an idea into motivation to start the path of getting it published and out there? How long have you been working on it? First ideas I came up with, the origins of it really actually were from like 2010. That's when I started kicking around the idea, but I didn't really work on it seriously for years. It was just something I'd fiddle with here and there after work, and then drop for a couple years and then pick up again. It was only in the last several years that I really decided to focus on it. Ironically, what really made me start buckling down to want to finish it was during COVID. A friend of mine, editor of this video, hey Tim.
Oh, hey Peter.
He said, Peter, you should just finish the game. And I said, okay. And I've just been going hard ever since, really, getting it into a place where it can be play tested and then running play tests and showing it to others and then doing the social media here on YouTube. Really, it's just, I like creating things. I've always been homebrewing and writing adventures and all of that stuff. And it just seemed like a natural thing to do, to take this passion I had and share it with the community and really just try to make something of it. And, wherever that takes me, I'm down for it. At the end, I would just like to have a copy of the book sitting on my shelf, right? The Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld, I can say, I made that. And some other people liked it too. That would make me immensely satisfied. So yeah, it's been a while, but really only the last several years I've been cooking on it. Sholynyk in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, so after watching your Blood Oilers video, do you have anything related to mutation or change afflictions or consequences? For example, if the player was dragged away by the Blood Oilers and their group managed to save them halfway through the transformation. That's a super cool idea. So right now, there aren't a ton in the way of long-term curses or mutations that the players can receive, mainly because I just haven't focused much development time on it. I'm still considering things like long-term scars or debilities that you can have over time as a record of all the harrowing things you've experienced. But I haven't codified a lot of that quite yet, but I definitely see where there would be design space there. I don't want to blow up the scope too much of the project, but I think that would be very cool. We do have some choices the players can make at character creation to give themselves different origins, like something that makes them undead or mutated and things like that. And in theory, you could have a precedence where you could take that edge after character creation if the story really dictated it. I'd be open to that sort of thing. But right now, there isn't really a lot of structure to that. Maybe I should add it. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, you've run some games with people at events, as well as, I assume, some more playtesting with other groups. What was the experience like demoing your game? Any particular stories you want to share? Oh yeah, I've run the game for a lot of people at this point. One of the most informative tests was I ran 3 long-form playtest campaigns. The same campaign for 3 different groups, lasting about 6 to 8 months each. And those were very involved. Characters, gained power and leveled up. And there was a story, and that was incredibly informative, particularly around my monster design, how the threats would work and things like the death spiral. All of that really began to get iterated on and refined during that process. The demos have really actually shown me that I've got something here, because when players first play the game in a demo, they haven't read the rules, I've just had to give them a quick start guide or a one-pager. There's a moment in a fight where it really clicks for them, where they start working together to take down an enemy, rather than just using an ability on their sheet, oh, I cast this spell and then I wait. They actually would talk and coordinate and synergize to dismantle the way the enemy can fight back, right? Taking out the dangerous limbs or hitting them in the leg to slow them down. Where that happens and the players really start playing the game as I envision it has been really satisfying to see. And I've seen that in the demos that I've run. It's very cool. Sholynyk in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, how well does PvP fit into your system? Have you had players fight each other? So, I haven't really had any players fight each other in any of the playtests so far, not really, but the game does accommodate, from a mechanics standpoint, players attacking other players. And that's because the game uses the more traditional physics engine style system. What I mean by that is the game is constructing how the world works regardless of the players being there, how any 2 characters would attack one another. That's how the game is structured, and that's different from games like Blades in the Dark, which are asymmetrical in their design. Blades in the Dark doesn't really have a good way for the players to attack each other. Similarly, a game like Cypher. It doesn't really work if the players are trying to attack one another because it's not the structure of the game. Not that I think Tales from Elsewhere games are meant to have player versus player engagements. That's not the point of the game, but the physics, the structure of the rules don't impede you from doing so. It's not like in Cypher where like if I'm running a game and two players want to hit each other, I'm like, I don't know how this resolves because the GM doesn't roll any dice in that game at all, so how would we do this? So it's not like that, but not the intended gameplay of the system. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, the fast, evocative combat with your injury system seems to be a core component for your game. Was this always the case? How did you see it adapted for settings after Clockworld? So this injury system actually came fairly late in the process, considering I was kicking the game around for over a decade now. And before that, I was using a modified hit point system with some refreshing stamina and then an underlying like vitality. And it was kind of cool, I was trying to mix up the hit point game, but since I was coming from such a traditional tabletop role-playing game background, it was hard for me to break out of that Dungeons and Dragons mindset initially. But once the injury system came about, then the whole game clicked into place and everything got reconfigured around it. So no, it actually, the biggest selling point I think of the game is this injury system, and it actually came about later. And it was only once that was integrated that I really thought I had a game worth showing to others. All right, Zertryx in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, was there any game mechanics or features that you originally wanted in the game, but ultimately decided to drop for the betterment of the game itself? Whether that be because they conflicted with other mechanics, didn't fit the feeling you wanted, they were out of the scope for the game, etc. That's a great question. There have been so many systems that I have built and slaved over and then abandoned. Some examples would be I had fairly involved facing rules during combat, where you declare what direction you're facing. There was all these things if people were behind you, and I realized it was interesting from like a tactical standpoint, but it actually muddied the tactical play, because what direction you're facing isn't the most interesting or evocative thing for you to choose in a tactical fight. It's just, it ended up bogging the game down and drawing attention away from things like the gunplay or the violence of it. So that was a big one to get rid of. I had extremely complex experience systems in the game where different things would grant different XP numbers, and those XP numbers would be spent to upgrade various skills and gain new abilities. It was very involved. And again, it was drawing a lot of attention away from a core experience that I was attempting to evoke in the game. And the more I cut away that chaff, cut away that fat, the more the strong parts of the game began to emerge. So yeah, the game was incredibly complicated in its early days, mainly because I was basing it off of Cyberpunk 2020, which is a very complicated game. But over time, cut it down a lot. Muto2525 in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, is there any game mechanics for handling social interactions? How do they work? So, where a game places a lot of mechanical depth is where the game tends to focus. And for the Clockworld setting, the social interactions and roleplay in that side is not a focus of the game, so I've kept the systems very simple. That's because the game is focusing on an action horror sort of gameplay. Having said that, I've borrowed a lot from the 4th edition D&D skill challenges setup, where you can apply this to both mundane tasks as well as socialization. It uses a very simple skill test versus somebody's grit, defense, resolution. Again, I wanted something expedient, not something deep for this book. Now, that doesn't preclude us from maybe layering on something more advanced, like I have very specific ideas for later books that would make social interaction more complex and more a focus of the game. But I'm a firm believer in not over-mechanicizing subsystems that draw attention away from the core experience you're aiming for in a game. Brendan in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, I am curious how I will be able to abuse luck. Brendan is a long-term playtester, and the luck system, which allows rerolls and adding narrative elements from a player-facing manner to the game, has some edges that allow you to utilize luck and interact with it. And his character in one of the long-term playtests is actually inspiration for one of the demo pre-gens that is in the packet. The character Mine is based on Brendan's playtest character, and that character attempts to utilize luck, which is a primarily narrative system, to also fuel their high damaging melee attacks. So I think it's not too overpowered. We definitely need to test it, so let me know if you run the demo characters and you try out Mine and it feels OP. Let me know. Let Brendan know. Sholynyk in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, how much crossover is there in your Clockworlds to classic fantasy? Do you have elves and dwarves and whatnot, or is it focused on a human-centric experience? So, Clockworld, the setting, does not have any fantasy of any kind. Not in that way. You're all just people against monsters. It's humanity. Even though there's diversity within humanity, as there are some origins that you can have, like you could be mutated or maybe even undead, but it's still just humanity against monsters. And I'm not a fan of creating a bunch of speciation in my fantasy settings as much. That's not where I find the interesting diversity of story to be. I like differences in culture primarily, and that's where my emphasis tends to be. So even in the medieval fantasy setting that I am working on for Tales from Elsewhere, it's still pretty squarely going to be people that you are, not dwarves and elves and halflings. I think the Tolkien-esque fantasy has its place, and I do love it. I mean, I play a lot of D&D and I read Tolkien, but that's not really the type of narrative that I'm going to be going for. I don't want to give something that people already have in spades in other books and settings. There's plenty of elves and dwarves and all of that, so I'm trying to make this definitely more human or person, I would say, centric experience. Florian in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, what are the pros and cons of having conditions be caused by injuries instead of unifying injuries and conditions into one concept? This is a very good question and one that I've definitely grappled with a lot. So this might need a whole video kind of unpacking it, but the mechanicizing of a system places emphasis. And so if Tales from Elsewhere used a generic conditions-based structure where everything is just a type of condition, like broken leg is a condition, or being shot is a condition, bleeding being a condition unto themselves, that works very well and there's nothing wrong with it. But by housing things in an injury and using that sort of language about receiving a critical injury and that injury having complications, is drawing the player's focus onto that structure. And I wanted the game to be about that structure, to be about these visceral injuries that you're writing on the sheet, and to make it that bloody, meaty process where that physical aspect is where the detail is, rather than having an equal amount of complexity for other types of conditions. So games like Call of Cthulhu, for example, have a fairly in-depth mental injury sort of situation, right? A big threat is that you're going mad and insane and that kills you. That's awesome. I wanted this game to have that sort of interesting structure, but focused on the meat, focused on the body, and that body horror that can create when, the xenomorph takes a bite out of your leg, or a zombie catches you on the shoulder and takes a bite. All of that becomes all the more gruesome and focused on when you put that as part of a physical process that an injury or wound system creates. CarbonCorgi in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, out of curiosity, what encounter frequency, if any, are you building Tales from Elsewhere around? Going for a more traditional half a dozen plus encounter a day endurance test, or going for something with fewer encounters per day akin to a lot of modern campaigns? Or something in the middle? Or is it a system that's altogether agnostic to that metric in the first place? That's a really good question, and again, one I might need a long-form video to really break down. But what I will say is that Tales from Elsewhere games in general focus on in-the-moment threats. Interesting decisions about that scene, about what you do then, not necessarily focusing on zooming out to what an adventuring day or an adventure would look like. I want the players to focus on the now, more so on an optimization of resources and scarcity long term. So there are no abilities in the game that are a once per day sort of structure. There's nothing like that. I don't find it interesting when your adventuring day is cut short because you've run out of interesting abilities to use. That doesn't feel great. I'm not a big Vancian spellcasting fan. So, it's not fun that you have to stop adventuring because the spellcasters are out of the fun things that define their character. Not a huge fan of that. I'd rather the players focus on that short-term, immediate need. And so What will stop an adventure from continuing in a Tales from Elsewhere game is the accumulation of injuries. So these injuries don't necessarily make you weaker at fighting, but they start filling up that injury tracker, and when that happens, it becomes more and more likely that you just die or that you receive more severe injuries. So that is more likely what would prevent the players from continuing on. But it's not so much a game where the players are the aggressors in the world, going out on an adventure to go conquer a dungeon. The action horror genre means that the players are capable, but they're more on the receiving end of the world and are just trying to make it to the next day or make it back to town. That's more of the structure that we'd see. So the game works if you just have a single fight in a single day, because every fight should be interesting, not just having fodder fights to drain your resources to make the last boss battle more interesting because you're out of spells or something like that, which is not the structure that the design is going for. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, how did Tales from Elsewhere evolve during development? Were there any ideas that you ended up cutting out? Did you get any eureka moments that changed the direction, or moments where you found things finally clicked in place? The game is almost unrecognizable from a system standpoint from its origins. Like I said in one of the other questions, Cyberpunk 2020 was an inspiration initially, and I have veered way off from that. It's not recognizable at all. The game had an immense amount of fiddly bits and numerical complexity and just a lot of math to it in its initial stages, and over time I've cut that down to have a more simple but still evocative and tactical structure to it. But what really, the biggest eureka moment was the injury system. The injury system actually came along a little later, and when that was figured out, when I first started fiddling with that idea many years ago, I knew, okay, I had something here. And then the whole game shifted around that injury system and became restructured to accommodate that, because using a harm or wound or injury system is something that you want to build around, not something you just add on top, right? So the whole game had to be reconfigured to accommodate it. Muto2525 in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, will Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld include any GM tools? If so, can you give us any examples? Absolutely. The final rulebook will have a pretty extensive GM tools section, mainly focusing on how to run action horror style games, guidance on how to use the various monsters and threats and hazards, as well as ways to customize things to make new monsters, as the templating is fairly easy. The intention is to really provide a nice backbone for the game master to run a game. I don't know if I'm quite as good as the creators of Mothership are at creating a GM guidance section, but I'm definitely working on it and hoping to provide some useful tools for the GMs to run their games. Brage in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, what, if any, design parts of the game have you been least certain about? What alternatives did you consider, and what eventually made you keep them? It's a very good question. So the encumbrance system is one of the newer systems to the game, and I've gone back and forth on a number of ways to track how much you can carry, how you conceptualize that. You know, originally I did the usual, it's just number of pounds based on like a strength score, and I didn't really like that, and I've been iterating it over a long period of time, and I'm not super certain that the current system works perfectly, but I think it's in roughly the right spot here. So I like an abstracted encumbrance system where you still need to worry about how much you're carrying and what loadout you bring with you into the ruination, but it's not bogged down by, you know, the number of pounds of various things. It's using just an abstracted number. You're carrying usually 1 to 10 encumbrance worth of things. Like a revolver might be 2 encumbrance, a knife might be 1. So it keeps it fairly simple while still adding some decision making, and you do worry about things that are in your bag versus things that you have equipped, so you have to like open your bag to get things out. But I don't know, we're gonna have to see how this one play tests, and we'll iterate on it if it's not feeling perfect. Lilli Von Doom in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, you have previously mentioned that you might be eventually licensing the combat system OGL style. What might that look like for those of us who are super excited by your approach to combat philosophy? Further, have you put any thought into having third-party playbooks? So I don't believe that role-playing games should prevent others from being inspired by them and adapting from them. I don't have anything super concrete to say at this time, but I'm really excited that other people are excited about the combat structure I've created. So the tentative plan right now, in the same vein that games like Blades in the Dark have Forged in the Dark, or you can have something powered by the Apocalypse, all I'd really want is if somebody bases their game off of my combat system to just, tip their hat to me and notify people, hey, where this comes from. I came up with a cheeky label for it. It could be a Whisper of Elsewhere, so somebody could have the acronym WHOA. It's kind of fun. But I'm not doing anything too hardcore in that regard, and I will definitely have something public-facing that states the nature of an OGL, and it will be very permissive. I'm not the kind of person that believes that I should clutch this to my bosom and not let anybody else create in that space. That's why I'm sharing this all with all of you on YouTube. So if these rules are inspiring to you, don't worry about me coming after you for some sort of trademarking issue. Not going to be the case. I want to share this with everybody. And third-party splat books would be super cool, especially things like other adventures and other content tying into Tales from Elsewhere. I think that'd be lovely. It's a lot for me to just write myself mostly here, right? So if the community ends up getting involved with Tales from Elsewhere and producing more content for the community, more power to them. Just so long as people acknowledge, hey, this is based on the game I made. That's all I'd really care about. Mike Birkhead in the Design Discord asks, what's your favorite pasta recipe? Some sort of chicken Alfredo, probably. I'm not a big pasta eater, but some sort of Alfredo base would be the one. BoweFlex in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, how did you make the decision between using a system that would be familiar to players, like a D20 or a D6, versus creating your own system that you felt expressed your ideas better, but may deter some players from picking it up? Was that a concern for you? No, it wasn't really a concern for me, to be honest. There is such myriad diversity in the tabletop role-playing game space as far as designs go that, I think it's a good thing to break out from whatever you're accustomed to, breaking away from the D20. But really, it was just about choosing systems that served the design goal of the game. I knew that I was going to be making a fairly niche product here, right? This is Weird West, it's action horror. This is just not going to be for everybody. And so I embraced that and just made the decisions that I thought best served the game, not decisions that I thought would make the game more palatable to the masses. There are plenty of games out there like that already that are, in the Dungeons and Dragons space, right? There's lots trying to do that and stay within that realm. And I just didn't think I had anything meaningful to contribute to that space. So instead, going off in my own direction, and I think the game is much better for it. Zeke in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, who is this game not for, and what kind of stories will the system not be good for telling? That's actually a really good question, and I think a lot of systems need to ask themselves that, right? A designer needs to ask, who are they not designing for? So the Tales from Elsewhere games are not for people looking for a heroic fantasy. One where they are the champions of the story, where they will always come out on top, where their personal narrative is the core experience of the game. Tales from Elsewhere games are about the players surviving a world that is hostile to them and overcoming that through their skills and wits and cooperation. So it's not one where my personal backstory and that narrative is going to be the through line in a game necessarily. It will still be included, sure, you can still incorporate that, but the game is not one where the players make a change on the world, where they make their will manifest. It's more concerned with things like, can they make it back to town after their train derails in the middle of the ruination? That's more of what they're concerned about, not king-making and anything of that scale, right? They're not fighting gods and anything. They're just trying to make it through another day. Anrate Esor in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, what does your design compass look like for this project? What are the key points that are motivating and driving your specific design? I believe the strong focus you have on a specific setting and concept is key, where I can see a project like DC-20 starting to fray and slow under the bloat of feedback diffusing the original sharp vision that sold the project. Curious on your perspective on the things that go into accomplishing a specific design versus a general one. It's a really good question. So I don't consider the Clockworld rulebook to be an overly ambitious project. I know my limitations as a designer, both from a time and skill standpoint, and I'm not interested in making the game more than what I already intended to be. So even when I do take this to crowdfunding, the stretch goals and such aren't going to be things that like blow up the game's scope from a huge standpoint. It's just going to make the game higher quality. That's really what it's going to be. It'll be for more artwork, more layout designs. But I think that scope creep is a real issue with projects, and I don't want to promise something to the community and start taking money from them and then have the scope blow up and it takes me 2.5 years to deliver that product to them. I'd rather come in with a discrete list of exactly what I intend to put in the game and then deliver that to people so that there's no ambiguity about what the product really is. As far as what keeps me focused, I'm just a fairly driven person, and I don't find it too hard to stay focused. But now that I'm on YouTube, I've actually found all the feedback and community to be incredibly motivating for working on this project. So please keep it up. Keep talking to me in Discord and giving me feedback, because that is the fuel to my fire right now. The fact that people are actually interested in this game is a huge motivator. The TableTalkCrew, which is a really cool YouTube channel that I've appeared on once and I want to appear on again, hey guys, they ask in the YouTube comments, what have you found has been the most difficult part in developing your RPG so far, and what has been the most effective way you've found to tackle it? The user experience has been one of the hardest parts for me. I am not a layout designer or graphic designer, UX designer, so creating things like a usable character sheet, the flow of a rulebook, this has been very difficult for me. It is just not a skill set I have. I'm a decent game designer and I can analyze rules fairly well, but that has definitely been a challenge. And one way I've tackled it is really by asking others for help. There's nothing wrong with that, asking people who have that knowledge to assist me and give me guidance and give me feedback, and in some cases just to help me build it. So getting the help from others has been immensely helpful from a user experience standpoint, and also then submitting things to the public, like in the demo packet, is a good way to get feedback on how terrible some of my designs are, but that's definitely been the hardest part for me. Ritehunter in the Design Discord asks, what inspired the introduction of Lovecraftian horror elements? What would you say is the appeal of adding that into a setting? And what is your favorite Eldritch horror story? I'm a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft's work. Not the guy, of course, he was terrible, but the works are amazing. Cosmic horror is a very evocative and interesting, and I think thought-provoking form of horror. It doesn't rely so much on things like jump scares or shocking imagery. It's more about growing dread and making you think and worry about what you don't know. And I've just found that wildly entertaining over the years. I've read most of H.P. Lovecraft's works and some Robert E. Howard as well, and I just find them a lot of fun, and I think adding them to a setting is interesting, and especially when those aren't often combined. Lovecraftian horror and the Wild West aren't super common. I mean, Weird West is already a fairly niche genre as it is. As far as favorite Lovecraftian horror or cosmic horror stories, that's tough. The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft is definitely one of my favorites. That and the Picture in the Room by him the Picture in the House by him are probably my two favorites of his stories. And I know those aren't super popular picks necessarily for those really into H.P. Lovecraft, but I'm just a big fan of those. The TableTalkCrew, which is super cool YouTube guys, go check them out, on YouTube comments asked, do you have any enemies that are directly inspired by other acts of fiction? And if so, what acts of fiction and enemy info can you provide? So yeah, I'm definitely inspired a lot by works of fiction, movies, books. I'm trying to keep as many of the threats in the game as original as I can, just to try not to repackage something people have already seen. But some things like zombies, I've got to have those in there. Those are obviously going to be the case. Even the Blood Oiler, which is moderately original, is definitely inspired by things like Terminator or the Reavers from Firefly. So I've definitely tried to draw on popular media. I also read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of Westerns. I read Indigenous myth. And so I'm having my own spin on things like Skinwalkers and Wendigo and the Latish, trying to provide my own Weird West Lovecraftian horror version of these. But yeah, I read a lot of books and I watch a lot of movies, so I'm definitely inspired by a ton of stuff like that. The list would be too long to read here on this YouTube video. Wiley in the Design Discord, hey Wiley, asks, what is your ideal balance of game systems and elements? To elaborate, how much combat, conversation, exploration, etc., and how much math versus vibes versus roleplay versus preparation, and so forth? That's a really good question, and I think every game should be conscientious about what they're focusing on. And I've maybe talked about this before, where what a game mechanicizes and emphasizes is then what the game is about. And a lot of games try to provide equal emphasis to each of the pillars of design, like exploration, combat, socialization. They try to make it do everything, and sometimes that works okay, but more often than not, I think a game becomes more focused and efficient when it's trying to tell specific stories. And Tales from Elsewhere games are just that. It's more narrowed down. It's not trying to tell every type of story. And so accordingly, the emphasis is more on combat. It's a very tactical game. I like the meaty nature of it. There's a lot of cool things you can do. And the social or exploration sides are much lighter in their system focus. And that's intentional. I don't think that's the right answer for every game, but it's what the right answer is from Tales from Elsewhere. It's just the focus of that product. I don't believe that a game necessarily benefits from having really complicated mathematics. Some games, that's definitely fun, but I like games that give you interesting decision trees over having you do a lot of math. So Tales from Elsewhere doesn't emphasize mathematics, but it emphasizes choices. Tactical choices, character build choices, none of which are complex from an arithmetic standpoint. And I think that every game should focus a lot on vibe. Unless you're making a purely generic game, having a game that drips and oozes vibe and flavor is definitely the way to go. And as you can see from some of the art that I produced, it's just dripping with cool. So that's my quick version of answer to that question. Retrofit in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, if you're a designer that intends to publish, should you buy a domain name early? Yeah, if you can spare the money for that. If it's not a big deal to you to get a domain name in, especially if it's something that you worry might be taken by others, if you can afford that cash, sure, grab the domain name. It doesn't hurt to do so, and in theory, you could always sell it later. But when it comes to anything in game design, be very cautious about how you're spending your money, as there isn't money to be made in tabletop role-playing games, right? It's not like a get-rich-quick sort of genre, right? It's not an industry where you're going to go make a fortune. And it's okay to put money into a project. I've put a lot of my own cash into this project so far, mainly for artwork. But definitely don't spend outside of your means. So if the recurring fees of owning a domain would be difficult for you to afford, definitely don't worry about it, right? Worry about marketing later. Just focus on making a game first. Wrong on Porpoise in the Design Discord asks, do you have any character archetypes you particularly love or hate? What are some of your favorite ways that those characters have been represented? Well, I don't really like the overly lecherous character archetypes in games. I'm just not there to do that kind of thing, to flirt with NPCs controlled by my buddy. That's just not where I'm at. So I usually don't play characters that do so or particularly enjoy interacting with them. As far as ones I love playing washed up, irresponsible losers. I just like being not an anti-hero, but just somebody who isn't called to heroism. I like being somebody who struggles and doesn't always succeed and really gets, thrown through the grinder over the course of a game. And I find that really entertaining. I find failure almost more entertaining than success for characters in role-playing games. Part of that's because I've been playing for so long, I seek out kind of new story type experiences for my characters, having played heroic fantasy for many years. Now I try to fit in my losers into any game I can. Mike Birkhead in the Design Discord asks, what skills would a character in your game need to survive an attack from 500 Mudengs? Well, who could survive such an adorable and terrifying horde? So a horde of 500 Mudengs would be very difficult to survive, mainly because the horde rules in Tales from Elsewhere are very deadly. So more so than just a swarm, it's a stampeding swarm or horde of undead zombies, right? You can't just fight that. So the horde rules are about insurmountable odds that you're meant to more escape and not fight back directly. Having said that, to fight 500 Mudengs in the Clockworld setting, you would probably just need a lot of dynamite and gunpowder barrels and funnel them into a narrow place and then blow the whole thing up. I mean, explosives are the answer to hordes, I suppose, but come on. Mudeng is a cute, if not terrifying, little pygmy hippo. Why would you want to blow him up with dynamite? DarkTycon in the TFE Discord asks, Is the game going to try to lean heavily into a full skill-based system with edges, or have a semblance of a class system where edges will be bucketed? This means they require edge chains, multiple prerequisites, or some edges will void out the selection of others. So Tales from Elsewhere games are entirely classless and very free-form, but the way your character starts is determined by your backstory elements. And this isn't really like a class per se, but it does create some initial bucketing. For example, if you want to take supernatural edges, you need to have chosen a backstory element that would give you that bucket on the list you can pick from. So you can't just be a lawman from the big city who is on the hunt and also have supernatural powers at character creation. It's not part of your story. Just like if you want to be really good at shooting a gun, you can't just be a politician from a farm who is wandering the world. None of that would give you firearm training, right? So there is some restriction initially on character creation based on a backstory, but it's not very rigid. And after character creation, as your character continues to grow, you're free to expand in any direction you want, pick whatever you want. It's only that initial instantiation of the character that has some amount of restriction to it, but it's fairly open still. You get a lot of choice within those backstory elements to customize. We haven't had any worry about characters feeling too duplicative with each other. There's just too many options out there and too much freedom in that regard. Wrong on Porpoise from the Design Discord asks, I would love to hear more about your design philosophy, not just for your game, but your takes on other genres. For example, have you taken any specific lessons or mechanics from games outside your genre? Are there any elements you particularly respect or admire from tactical, OSR, or narrativist schools? That's a really good question, and one that I could probably spend an entire video, long form, talking about. But in brief, I think every genre has a lot to teach us about game design, even if it's not something you'll necessarily leverage. For Tales from Elsewhere games, I wanted to embrace some of the creativity and evocation that story-first or narrative-based games use when describing physical injury. I just wanted to push that into a tactical style game, but not something quite as crunchy in the minutia as something like Lancer or Pathfinder 2e. So trying to find a middle ground between those systems to create the core injury system from Tales from Elsewhere was what I was going for. So, like I said, I think I could talk for a long time about that. I'll have to put a pin in that and do that in a long-form video. Pinecone in the Tales from Elsewhere Discord asks, what are some of your favorite TTRPGs? Did any of them inspire Tales from Elsewhere? Well, I mean, sheer number of hours, I've played Dungeons & Dragons the most of any RPG, by far. I mean, I've been playing it for 24 years across something like 5 editions now, so I always have a special place in my heart for Dungeons & Dragons. I still play it regularly. I'm in a 5.5 game right now, and so I always have a love for it. Even though I am critical of a lot of its rules and design decisions, doesn't mean I don't still enjoy it and love it. So that's been a favorite. I actually also have a soft spot in my heart for Cypher System. I know it's not for everybody, but I ran a lovely superhero game using the Cypher System, and I just found it to be pretty fun to use. It's definitely a bit flawed. Other systems like GURPS I also really appreciate. Mutants and Masterminds and all of its flaws were a lot of fun too. Cyberpunk 2020, which is such a goofy rulebook, was the initial inspiration to start making my own game, so that's the short list there. Also have to tip my hat to Deadlands. Deadlands is an obvious inspiration for this genre and really is the biggest name in Weird West. But it's not the only name. I'm seeing a lot more of that out there right now. So that's my short list of favorite tabletop role-playing games. KB in the TFE Discord asks, I notice in your bio that you're a philosopher. I am wondering if any philosophies or philosophical principles were intentionally considered in the production of TFE. If you feel comfortable elaborating on your background in philosophy as well, that would be cool. Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I actually did maintain a philosophy blog that I have buried many years ago, and I still like to read philosophy, and not as into it as I used to be now that I'm more into game design. But I haven't really injected specific philosophical concepts into the setting of Clockworld because it's not really the place for that to be done. My own perspectives on ethics and religion and all the things I've studied have made their way into the game, and that it's helped me to develop belief systems for the game, but not so much my own personal opinions on the subject. but I will say that my thought that humanity should be banding together against evil is present in the Clockworld setting, as it's really these hardy survivors all having to come together to thwart the monsters of the Ruination. So some of my rough philosophical and ethical concepts kind of wriggled their way in. But no, it's not an overly philosophical game, just like the movie Aliens isn't a particularly philosophical film, right? It's just not the vibe it's going for. Danderskoff in the Design Discord asks, how do you feel about your new niche internet micro-celebrity status? How do you feel about seeing people talk about your opinions out in the wild? It's been very surreal, actually. It all happened very fast. I mean, we planned a lot for the launch of the YouTube channel, but the attention we got was much more than I was expecting. It's been really great and heartening. But I'm kind of a paradox. I'm an extrovert. I gain a lot of energy from social interaction, but I'm also a very private person at the end of the day. I like to sit at home in the quiet, read a book with my wife, enjoy a cup of tea. So the combination of those two things seems to have worked well for YouTube, where I can record something in the quiet of my office and then put it out there and then have these sort of parasocial relationships. It's strange. It's been fun though, and I'm really having a blast and enjoying talking to all of you about game design. So I know that was a marathon of a video, and I want to thank you if you've made it this far. As always, your support from this channel, both here in YouTube or in Discord, is immense. I can't thank you all enough. So please hit the like, subscribe, share button. It always helps us out, and I will catch you on the next video.